Tell me about your upbringing as a Muslim.
I was born in the Washington, D.C. area, raised somewhat in Baltimore, and then moved back to Washington, D.C. I was born in 1972, and my mother taught us about Islam. My father taught me about Islam. I went to Sunday school from the time I was about 8, but I also had, my parents had Muslim friends who also taught their children about Islam as well. So I was exposed to a Muslim community much more in depth so after the Iranian Revolution, which happened when I was 8 years old. My father was very much involved in the fight of the Iranian Revolution in the United States with the Persian students here in the U.S. in the late 70s and early 80s.
Okay, and how are you related to Anthony Ben Salah?
Anthony is my 11th great-grandfather. So my mother's father's father, about 7 grandfathers up, and then his mother's father is Anthony von Saleh.
Okay. And who is Anthony and Abraham von Saleh?
Anthony and Abraham von Saleh were 2 sons of a couple from Morocco. The mother actually was born and raised in Spain, and the father was a Dutch man who converted to Islam or reverted to Islam.
Okay. Do you have any more information about the father's conversion?
Sure. John Jansoon, he was considered to be, he's thought of as a pirate, but he was actually a privateer, and a lot of people don't know the difference. In those times during the Anglo-Spanish Wars, the main type of warfare that you participated in was the harassing of ships. And you had to be paid by a government oftentimes. So pirates, they were in this business for themselves, but privateers were paid by people. So Jan Jansoon was first a privateer in 1600 for the Dutch. Soon after that, he started to become a privateer. He left the Dutch military and started to fight for the people of Saleh. The people of Saleh were sort of an independent nation. They became this Republic of Saleh. They were in the area of Morocco, but they were not necessarily under the rule of Morocco. And if you go to Saleh today, the tourists will point to Saleh and tell you, oh, that's where the pirates docked. But again, they weren't necessarily pirates because they had a republic that they were fighting for. I had a friend who could translate Spanish, Arabic, and English, and she helped me to go through some other sources and other languages to find information about the wife of Jan Jansoon von Saleh. She was actually, what I learned from that is she was actually part of the Hornochos tribe in Spain. And the Hornochos tribe left Spain and came to Morocco. They established a government of 14 parliamentary members. And they elected Jan Jansoon as their president because he was a very good captain. And he later changed his name to Murad Rais II. When he would even sign his name as Murad Rais later on after that. So he married one of the daughters of the parliamentary members, and her name was, people refer to her today as Margarita. He left his Dutch wife from Holland. He had 3 children with her. He left her and married Margarita. And several years after, his daughter came to visit Saleh and begged him to come back and to leave privateering, and he refused. So Margarita and Jan Jansoon had at least 4 boys and maybe 1 girl. Another source that I have consulted with is actually descendants of Jan Jansoon in Saleh, in Morocco. In Morocco, they have a tradition of filing with the government your lineage if you're related to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this family on Margarita's side can trace their family lineage to Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam through a major king that used to rule Morocco too as well. So I have filed my family's name and my children's name with the government of Morocco as being descended from the Prophet Muhammad. In a way, I was able to do that was through the lineage of being related to Anthony van Sallee.
Okay, that's beautiful. Okay, so tell me the historical significance of Anthony coming to Brooklyn. Was he the first, or explain that?
When he came originally, he came to Manhattan, which is not part of Long Island. That was where New Amsterdam was. There were 300 families that lived in Manhattan. They came here with the Dutch West Indies Company, which is a fur trading company. And most of the people that came were merchants. They were traders, they were investors. So when they came around early 1600s, 1620, 1624, they needed protection. They were very much close to the sea. New Amsterdam's right on the water. That time, like I said, the major source of warfare was harassing ships. You needed to have a good navy, and they needed protection. So they got protection from the Dutch government, because most of them were Dutch. And so that year that Anthony van Sallee came with Abraham, there was a drought in Morocco. And so his father being Dutch, it was a good opportunity for him to come live in New Amsterdam. The Dutch like to pride themselves as being different from the Spanish, because the Spanish were very discriminatory when it came to religion. They had the Spanish Inquisition, they enslaved Muslims and Jews or anyone who wasn't Catholic. And the Dutch, a lot of them were Protestants. They were actually part of Spain, and they wanted to become separate from Spain. So they had a lot of preaching of ideas about freedom of religion, and there was a treaty of New Utrecht that actually said that people should be, from 1575, that said that people should be able to practice their own religion, that they would have the right to practice their own religion. So Anthony van Sallee may have felt that he could be able to practice his religion among the other Dutch people, but as time would tell, that the people didn't actually live up to that idealism.
Right. So is he the first known Muslim in this area?
There were 3 known Muslims in the settlement of New Amsterdam. The 2 of them were Abraham and Anthony. There was one Egyptian named Nasruddin. When you get to the Charter of New Amsterdam, which was written several years after Anthony, Abraham, and Nasruddin were living in New Amsterdam, it does mention we welcome Turks and Egyptians. And Turks and Egyptians were the only 2 other types of other religious people that were there at the time. There was a time where Jews came as well. I think that was shortly after.
Are there any other family members outside of your immediate family that you know who were Muslim?
I mean, it depends how far out you go.
So let's just say in between when Anthony and Abraham came and today.
Well, it would be very hard for people in the colonial days to practice any religion other than Christianity, because everybody had, during colonial times, there was no freedom of religion. You had to pay the pastor's salary, and if you didn't, you were fined, sometimes jailed. Anthony van Sallee was one of those people. He was asked to pay the pastor's salary. Instead of paying the pastor's salary, he slandered the pastor and those who were in charge, and so then he was fined for slandering. So, like I said, it's very difficult to practice religion other than Christianity during the colonial times, with there not being any freedom of religion.
Do you have any information about how he navigated that?
He didn't navigate it very well, because I read one place that I don't know exactly how many court cases there were, but out of several court cases, let's say 43 court cases I read in one place, 15 of them at least, he was the defendant. So people picked on him. They saw him as Muslim. They called him the Turk. They accused him of things he probably didn't do, and took him to court all the time. So he had a very hard time, and he was definitely a target of Islamophobia throughout his whole life in New Amsterdam.
Okay, that's a good answer. Any triumphs that you can recount as well, or anything you noticed in terms of things that you think he was successful at doing?
He was a very successful investor. He had several pieces of land. He also was successful at one point in negotiating on his own behalf, or advocating for himself, because he, at one point, after all these court cases, he was seen as a troublemaker, and so he was banished from New Amsterdam, and he appealed the banishment by writing to the King of the Netherlands, and as a result he was awarded the 200-acre farm that was is now New Utrecht, or Gravesend. Today is Gravesend. And Gravesend includes Coney Island. Coney Island was also referred to as Turk Island because that was Anthony von Salé's property. So he was successful in that. He was successful in working with Quakers to harbor Native Americans. He was successful in creating the borough of Brooklyn along with Lady Moody, a Quaker, and several other residents who came there after him, including freed slaves.
So do you have any record of any other collaborations with Muslims throughout his life, or any other, even calling to Islam, anything like that? Any record of kind of bringing more attention to, what he believed and that kind of thing?
Well, although he wasn't able to teach his children Islam, he was able to pass down the concept of the one God and pass the Quran down in the family until 1925. We have a record of a report in 1925 that the Quran, which was written in the Zaydan, it was a Zaydan Quran, and it just one page of a Quran today sold for over $11,000. There were only a limited number of these Qurans produced. So he brought that Quran, one of those Qurans, to the United States, and he's believed to be the first person to have brought that Quran. He was a very good farmer. He raised cows on Long Island, but he also had orchards, and he's believed to be, he had 73 cherry trees on his orchard, and his orchard is the first record of cherry trees being in the United States, or being in North America.
Your mother mentioned also like her father, being a person who she clearly remembers her father talking about Tawheed, right? And you mentioned his passing it down. You have any other instances where throughout the family where you see this being transferred, even if it's not in the form of like Islam from a technical religion, but more from a belief and a tradition standpoint?
Well, there are sort of hypotheses based on what I have looked at. There are two graves. One is of Edward Spragg in Iowa, and it has the one finger. And then there's another grave of Captain Thomas Spragg, who fought in the Revolutionary War. And his grave appears to have a Kaaba on top of it. I looked up these symbols, and a lot of the symbol of the Kaaba especially is often associated with Masons. And it may be that people who didn't believe in the Trinity could practice some of their faiths in a Mason temple, or is more private. And I think that's my hypothesis, is how they were able to pass down the Tawheed was either through oral tradition in the family or through Mason temples. I'm not sure how else, but that's what my theory about it after I look into the graves and those sort of things.
Okay, that's great. And then how does it feel for yourself being a part of, knowing that you're a part of a family with a very early American Muslim ancestor?
When my mother told me this story and I looked it up to check it for myself, it really changed my life. Because all my life I was the child of an Iranian revolutionary, and I was very much felt to be an other. We would even refer to non-Muslims as those the Americans. We would never refer to ourselves as Americans. Whenever there was a Pledge of Allegiance read at school, or we sang the Star Spangled Banner, I would see people become full of emotion and pride of being American, and I didn't understand what that felt like. And when I heard this story, it was as if somebody had given me a sense that I didn't have, like you couldn't see, and now you put glasses on and you can see, or you couldn't hear, and somebody's when you're hearing aid, you can hear. I suddenly was able to connect and feel what it was like to be proud to be an American. And I learned that to be American doesn't mean that you have to connect with the typical narratives of the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock and these things. I learned that the American story is really made up of so many diverse narratives, and we really have to learn those diverse narratives, because if you don't tell your own history, somebody will tell it for you, and it probably won't include you.
Yeah, definitely. How did Anthony Van Sally's Muslim faith influence his life in the New World?
How did his faith influence his life? Well, he faced a lot of Islamophobia, for sure. There isn't a lot of evidence that he practiced, but he definitely came from a wealthy family, and at the time, any wealthy family would have educated their child. And at the time, being from a wealthy Muslim family, most wealthy Muslim families, the education you got was Quranic education. So it is very likely that he was a hafiz, or a person that has memorized the whole Quran. I don't know that for sure, but I would assume that. He had to get married on a ship. My theory is that he married on a ship because he married a Christian, and there would be no pastor that would have married a Christian to a Muslim. But on a ship, they have their own laws. Each ship is a floating republic with their own democracies on them. So that's why I believe he got married on the ship. So I think that was because he was Muslim. The not paying of the salary for the pastor, and so much of those things that he faced, those adversities he faced, being accused falsely of so many crimes. Now, there's one story that must be told. He had 4 daughters. He didn't have any sons. He married one of his daughters. He married Annika von Saleh, one of his daughters, to the neighbor. Was it Thomas Southard? He married her to the neighbor, Thomas Southard. And the dowry that was agreed upon was 20 cows. Now, if you're not a Muslim, you wouldn't understand why this is a problem. But if you're a Muslim, you understand very much that a dowry for a Muslim is different than a dowry for a European. A dowry for a European, the gift goes from the father of the bride to the groom. The dowry for a Muslim goes from the groom to the bride. If the agreed upon dowry was 20 cows, the groom, Mr. Southard, was expecting to get those 20 cows from his father-in-law. And the father-in-law was expecting his daughter to get the 20 cows from her husband. So when the son-in-law asked for the 20 cows and didn't get him, he was very angry. And they went through many court cases. And like I said, if you're not a Muslim, you wouldn't understand why this was a problem and why this misunderstanding existed. But I think there were several cultural misunderstandings like that because he was a Muslim. Now, he also there were a lot of misunderstandings. You had that one. There were a lot of misunderstandings about the family. One major one was about his wife. She's portrayed as a prostitute in many history books. But there's never any record that she had children with any other men, or there's no proof of it. What they base this on is that when her baby was born, she said to the midwife, "Does the baby look like my husband?" But he was swarth in color, so she wanted to know, did the baby look like her husband or her? Not did the baby look like her husband or some other men. But they would say that, and then she also was very outspoken, and she also committed slander and would insult people that would accuse her of things. So she, at one point, showed her undergarments, which would have been her petticoats. If she would have lifted up her petticoat to show just even part of her, or lifted up her dress to show part of her petticoat, that was an insult. So that has been taken out of proportion and used to paint a picture that she was a prostitute, which is not true.
Wow, yeah. This just sounds familiar, like so many other stories of Muslims and prophets. His name is significant descendants of Anthony Van Sally, that you know.
For sure, all the Vanderbilts.
And can you give a little summary of who they are, each one?
The Vanderbilts are a very wealthy family. If you go to Asheville, North Carolina, you'll see their home, the Biltmore, and it's the largest family home in the United States. You can tour the home. They're known as, during the 20s, they were one of the people that had monopolies and became very, very wealthy. They were friends with people who were inventors and that sort of thing. So then of course, people say that Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy is descendant from the Vanderbilts, as well as Warren Harding. And if you know the reporter, Anderson Cooper, he is descendant from a Vanderbilt. And a lot of people came to know the story of Anthony Von Salé when Anderson Cooper joined Finding My Roots episode. And what's his name? Gates. Henry Gates did his research. Henry Gates Jr. researched the ancestry of Anderson Cooper. That's how a lot of the stories started to come back up. Now, the Nation of Islam was very familiar with the story of Anthony Von Salé, and they wrote about it in Muhammad Speaks newspapers. So that was not the first record of Anthony Von Salé being taught.
Nice. Okay, so another thing I have is, what impact did Anthony Von Salé have on the local community and economy of New Amsterdam?
He was a big investor, so just like what any investor would have an impact on the area, bringing wealth to the area.
Okay. How has your family preserved the memory and legacy of Anthony Von Salé over?
I do a lot of work in trying to educate children. I'm a teacher. I work in education. I've worked in a Muslim school before. I work in public school now. And I've also run a local Sunday school near Dallas, Texas. And every time I'm teaching children, especially Muslim children, about the history of Islam, I really feel like they need to learn about the history of Muslims in America, because they are American Muslims. We a lot of times tend to use curriculum from Bangladesh and from Saudi Arabia, people who can't really relate to the struggles of Muslims in America. Yeah. So I worked with Brother Muhammad Al-Ahri to write 3 volumes of textbooks for children called Islamic American Heritage. Mm-hmm. Definitely was also inspired by Brother Amir Muhammad. And when I saw his museum, I just fell in love with all the work that he's doing. And so I worked with Brother Muhammad Al-Ahri to create these very child-friendly books for teachers to use. And I also go around and speak at different mosques about the stories of Muslims in America. And I have had a podcast that I've done the podcast is Did You Know? Mm-hmm. by Sister Nazi. And then I also am doing clubhouse discussions, which I hope to be also turned into another clubhouse or turn into another podcast, inshallah. So wherever I go, I'm always trying to teach people about the history of Islam in America and explain why it's so important for us to preserve that history and teach it to our children. Okay,
I want to know, so are there any misconceptions about Anthony Von Salé's life or legacy that you'd like to address?
Well, there is a Facebook page of Descendants of Anthony Von Salé, and I asked them the other day, what did they think they wanted me to tell you? And they only said that they wanted me to tell you that they are very proud to be descended from Anthony Von Salé. And I think that's an important message, because in my research of Muslims in America, or Islam in America, I've reached out to descendants of other Muslims in America, for example, the Wahhab family in Ocracoke Island. And they were very offended for me to imply that they may have been descended from a Muslim. And you'll go to some of these pages of family history, and they're trying to find any kind of way to prove that either their ancestor converted, or that their ancestor wasn't really a Muslim, or that this was all a lie. So I think the fact that these people that are in this Facebook group are actually proud to be descended from a Muslim speaks volumes.
Right. Okay. And I think about my last question, and then you can give me any other contributions, are how do you think that Anthony Von Salé's story contributes to our understanding of religious diversity in early colonial America?
Well, I think it just contributes to the diversity of the narratives of how people came to America. We need to start giving credit to all of the narratives and contributions of the enslaved people, the narratives and contributions of the Native Americans who were already here, the narratives and contributions of the merchants, of the salesmen. We have stories of the tamale salesman who traveled to America from the West. We have stories of indentured servants. There's so many different ways that people came to America and for different reasons, and we just need to recognize and diversify those stories so that people can feel included in the American history. I do want to say one thing. When you're talking about misconceptions, there's one misconception. A lot of people, when they talk about Jan Jansoon, they say he turned Turk, which is also interpreted to mean he became Muslim in 1618. But that was well after he would have married a Muslim person. So I think their misconception is that when he was captured in the Canary Islands at that time, he told the Ottoman Sultan that he would fight for him, because if you were captured, you have to give something to be free. So he told him he would fight for him for his freedom. So that's when, after that, he started to sail for the Ottoman Empire rather than just the Sallee Raiders, which the town of the Republic of Saleh. People interpret that as when he became Muslim, but I think you'd have to say that he became Muslim closer to 1600, 1605, something like that, because he was married to a Muslim woman. There are a lot of stories that Jan Jansoon's crew had to be Muslim. Now, Jan Jansoon wasn't the only privateer that turned Turk, the only European privateer that turned Turk. One of the most famous privateers that turned Turk was John Bertie, who's also known as John Sparrow from the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. There were several from many different European countries that had turned Turk.
Right. And for the audience, again, turned Turk means
that they went to go work for the Ottoman Empire and thus became Muslims.
Okay. So interesting. Okay. Any comments or any information you'd like us to know as we end this?
One of the things we didn't say about Abraham is that Abraham was married to a lady from Sudan, and his child was, of course, of color, and his wife was of color. And there is a will for Abraham, and the will leaves his wealth, which he would have been a pretty wealthy person, to his son, who was of color, which was very unheard of at that time. It was sort of the talk of the town for him to have left his wealth to this person. So that's very remarkable. Some people say that one of his descendants became one of the first people of color to become a doctor. I don't have that line of ancestry, but that's some part of oral history that is definitely told.
My name is Arlene Sprague Pater-Rov.
All right. How did you become a Muslim and when?
I was born Muslim.
All right. So tell me about the origin of Islam in your family.
My father taught me his concept of God and what God does. God was the original being that created everything, is creating everything, and maintains everything.
Okay, and how are you related to Anthony Van Sully?
He was my, I guess, 9th great, I'm not sure. He's my 10th great grandfather.
10th great grandfather. Okay, who is Anthony and Abraham Van Sully?
They were the first to settle on Long Island, New York.
Okay.
First settlers.
First settlers to settle on, first Muslim settlers?
First settlers.
In general?
In general. Soon after Plymouth Rock.
Can you expound upon that a little bit more? The details you have about that?
Well, his father was Muslim. John Jansen was a Muslim. He was born in the Netherlands and settled in what is now called Morocco. And he taught his children about Islam. He became the leader of a state in Morocco. It's called Saleh. So he was John Jansen Van Saleh, but they also call him Van Harlem.
Okay. Was Anthony the first known Muslim in Brooklyn, New York?
Anthony came with his brother Abraham Van Saleh.
Okay. And they were both known as Muslim?
They were both known as Turks.
Okay. Are there any other family members outside of your family who are Muslim?
No. I mean, they don't know. They consider themselves, one is, my father's side is Mormon, the other one is Catholic, but I think my father was influenced by his ancestors, by his father and his father's father and father's father, as to the concept of who God was.
Can you give any insight onto where that influence came from?
My father, his father was a scientist, a college professor in Michigan State College.
Mm-hmm.
And his father, my father was Francis William Sprague. His father, Frank A. Sprague, was college professor. His father was Ezra Sprague. He was a frontiersman. And his father was Edward Sprague. On Edward Sprague's tombstone, he has one finger.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's only one God. They all had the concept there's only one God, but I mean for a long time. But I guess some of them drifted from that.
Right. Okay. So it's kind of more of an Abrahamic faith thing, like they were. Have you seen or noticed any Islamic traditions passed down the family?
Just I see from my father. My father we got married in Newark, New Jersey. Lived with my mother in North Carolina. So he was totally different from them. And he didn't like going to Methodist church, but he promised his wife that when they got married that he would go to a Methodist church and he wouldn't tell us, the children, about in whatever he believed. She knew that he wasn't Methodist, but she also made him promise that he would raise us as Muslim. He would allow us to be raised as Methodist.
Okay. So but you knew that wasn't what he believed entirely?
Because when I was 4 or 5 years old, we were in the car and he says, I have to tell you something, but don't tell your mother I told you. Mm-hmm. I'm not Methodist. And then he told me the concept of one being, a powerful being that created everything. So that means, and is creating and sustainer of everything. So I'm thinking, that just makes sense. It's logical. But when I was 12 years old, my mother said, it's time for you to go to this class about becoming a member of the Methodist Church. And the preacher was telling us, we're all 12 years old sitting in a circle, and he was saying, in the Methodist Church, there's a Trinity. That means God is three, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I'm thinking, now I'm 12. I've been thinking since I was 4 or 5 that there's only one God. That's what my father had told me. But the preacher is telling me about the Trinity. And I'm saying, when I say God, I don't think about Trinity. I never thought that way.
So how did you end up? So when you grew up, were you Methodist first before you reconnected with Islam, or did you never believe it in the first place?
My mother took us to church every Sunday.
Yeah.
And we went to Sunday school, and also from there we went to hear the preacher talk.
Okay. So when did you officially say, okay, I'm Muslim and I'm following the religion of Islam?
Well, when I was 12,
mm-hmm.
I realized I wasn't believing in the Methodist Church,
Gotcha.
What they believed, because I didn't know what they believed until I was 12. So I'm saying, I've been going to this Methodist Church for 12 years. I didn't know what they believed, but I know that's not what I believe.
Okay.
So I was always saying, when I get to college, I'm going to search for the truth. So I always met a lot of foreigners, mm-hmm. from people from other countries, and I talked to them about their religion. And I met some Muslims, I met some Buddhists, people of all religions.
Okay.
And I became more friendly with the Muslims because I was, when I met my husband, I was 23 years old, and he would tell me about Islam, and he said, well, there was Adam and Eve, there was Prophet Abraham, and I'm saying, well, that's all in the Bible. It can't be too much different.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, when do you know about what age did you decide to start praying as a Muslim?
I started praying in 1975, about that time.
Okay.
And I prayed in Arabic.
And you prayed in Arabic? Okay. All right. So, how does it feel to be a part of how does it feel to be in the family of an American Muslim ancestor, like an early American Muslim ancestor? Do you feel like you're reconnecting? After
my father passed away, after the movie Roots, I started researching my ancestors. And my mother's side, it was one of my cousins did most of the information for me. So I worked on my father's side. My cousins, they had very little information except for one cousin, Frank. Because he's a Mormon, that's his obligation to know about his ancestors. So he did study the ancestors a lot, and he helped me a lot.
Okay, all right. And how do you feel now about it? Do you still look for things How does it affect you today?
Well, today I see the similarities. I like to look at the similarities. But in practice, people practice their religion differently. Some Muslims practice different from other Muslims. When I was reading about, I can't tell you the source exactly, but when I was reading about Anthony Van Saleh, first of all, his brother came with him. He came with an African lady. He was married to an African lady. And when they came over, my father was so different from people living in the South because he treated everybody as equals. In my mother's family, they weren't like that. They thought that black people should get one salary range and white people should get another salary range. And black people, that I'm talking about 1950, because I was born 1947. So in the 1950s, the school, there were black schools and white schools. The black school was close to us. I could just walk across the street and go down one block, but the white school was a mile away. And I often wondered about that and why my mother said, don't drink from that fountain. You have to drink from this fountain. Mm-hmm. And don't go to that bathroom, go to this bathroom. And my father, he had a nursery, a plant nursery. He sold plants and vegetable plants and flowers and flower plants. And he hired black people. He always made a point to hire black people and pay them the white people's salary. Mm-hmm. My mother didn't like it, and they constantly argued about that.
He fed people.
He would allow the employees to come into our house and eat, and my mother didn't like it. And it was like unheard of. You don't invite them to come in and eat.
You give them food on the patio.
And you can take the food out to the porch and give it to them.
And he also was in charge of the grave.
He was in charge of the graveyard at my mother's church, and there were a lot of slaves going to that church during the time of the Civil War. Before the Civil War, slaves went to my mother's church, Methodist Church, because it's built in 1834, and they were in the balcony, and they were buried in the cemetery behind my mother's church.
Brown Cemetery.
At Lee's Chapel Methodist Church, but their names were not put on their graves. Unmarked graves, and they weren't put in the log. Oh, well, his brother was married to a black person, and he was always kind to people. And what I read about Anthony was if someone was in debt, and they were put in prison for that, he would go and pay their bail and get them out.